Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I feel as if you were competing with the weather today, so this is a nice crowd. You know, I taught for history for 36 years, and I said I was done back in June. I was done teaching, and they keep roping me in, and I do love it. But when they asked me to do Chester's history in 45 minutes, I have to tell you, this is the most daunting task I've ever had, because as many of you know, Chester's history is really quite remarkable. So what I've done is I've given you, we're going to take like this long breadth of a journey through Chester's history. We're not going to go deep. If you want to go deep, you come to the Historical Society's museum and you can dive in a little bit deeper or get some of our books that we have. So this is going to be kind of an overview. So buckle up your seatbelts and here we go. I love this picture to start with, this wonderful colorized picture of Chester in 1836 from the Barber. John Barber did this. And as you're going to see as we go through, Chester really hasn't changed all that much. I want to bring this up very quickly because I've talked about this before. A lot of people don't realize, but there was a very strong Native American population in Connecticut when the English first came. And Chester itself had a group known as the Wangunks, which really kind of were from like Middletown, Cromwell, East Hampton, back down. We were the lower part of that. I like to always just mention, you all know this site here, it's Gillette's Castle looking down onto the Chester Ferry. But if we could go back to the 1920s, to that same view, and you can see this hill here. This hill here, no trees, very flat like that. And that hill, when the English first came, and the Native Americans told them that was Pattaconk. That hill is Pattaconk. And when they came, this is what they saw, Palisado Fort. And that Palisado Fort, even though the Wangunks were only there probably until the 1760s, even though they continued to have that tribal land for a decade or two after that, that tribal fort had been abandoned by the time we reached the American Revolution. Even though some people record in their diaries of Chester that they would play up amongst that particular fort. Many of you know this wonderful scene from the 1920s of Cedar Lake. What a lot of people don't realize is that when the white English first came to Chester, there were only 2 lakes or ponds in all of Chester. There was Cedar Lake, and there was Shipman's Pond, later known as Waterhouse Pond, which is where the water company is today. All these other ponds, as we're going to see as we go on a little bit later, were all mill ponds. This particular pond, when the English first came here, they couldn't believe, they called this Cedar Swamp Pond, and they couldn't believe that there was a beaver dam right where the road is today, when it flows underneath and goes into the marsh across, that this was a beaver dam that was so old and so large that the English would just bring their carts right across the top of it. And so this was there from the beginning, but the Native Americans in the winter would come out here and live. You all know this little spot right here, this yellow house that you're heading out to Chester for Cedar Lake, and that was known as Wigwam Hollow because the English let us know in the records that they had a little village right there. My guess is they lived out there all year round, but in the winter they probably moved away from their fort. But anyway, let's move on, and I want to bring you to this. This is what a lot of people don't realize, is that these 5 towns, Lyme and Old Lyme also, but I've kind of left them off at the moment, but these 5 towns made up the town of Saybrook. So when you look at the history of Chester, sometimes it's very hard, especially when you're in the pre-1836, it's very hard to kind of dig into the history because it's Saybrook's history. And a lot of times we don't know, were they living in Deep River? Were they living in Essex? It can be challenged. You can see that Chester was the very first to break away. Westbrook came after, Essex, Old Saybrook. Look at this. This is incredible. 1847. That's when Deep River finally officially became its own town. It had always been known as Saybrook, and I believe they kept messing up things between the 2 towns, Old Saybrook and Saybrook. So this is, and all of these have different villages. You know, Essex had the village of Centerbrook, which was Center Saybrook, and West Essex, which later became Ivoryton. Deep River had Winthrop, the village of Winthrop, the village of Deep River, and so forth. So anyway, we're going to start off our journey in the very beginning, pre-1836. And you know, the earliest document in the collection of the Chester Historical Society dates from 1679. And this is the earliest document we see where they're actually making a reference to the boundary between Haddam, Killingworth, and what we know today as Chester. Now, a lot of times people want to think that we were a town back then. So when we look at this dunk house, 1672, there's no one living around here in 1672. It's kind of like when they date the houses. You know, they look for when the the house shows up in the record, and then they look for when the land was purchased, and they kind of put that date on it. It always looks better. So I would probably say in the case of this dunk house, 1690, 92, 95, somewhere in there is probably a much better date for that particular house. But here, Jonah Dibble was probably our first person to come down into this area. This is the Thomas Dunk house. So where Jonah Dibble was living, we're not exactly quite sure. A lot of these old families, we see Andrew Warner coming in here right early on in the beginning. We see the Parkers, the Shipmans, the Waterhouses, the Webbs, and so forth. But if you could look kind of in those early decades, 1690s up through 1720, you're not seeing a lot going on in Chester. It's still it's the outskirts. It's kind of like the Native American, King Philip's War put an end to the Native American threat in New England, but I don't think people were willing to go this far away from Pettapog and what we know today as Old Saybrook. We see this wonderful house here we're built in 1702 on Spring Street and Straits Road. I used to have a lot of people when I was younger, they used to be looking at old houses that often would say this house was the oldest house. There was often a little controversy among some of the old timers which house was older between this one and the Dunk house. Probably we'll never know in this particular case. But when you'll notice, these are all built right close to a brook. This is right next to a brook. This one is right next to a brook. We see this wonderful house. Now, the front of this house is 1790s, but the back part of this house dates to about 1710. So again, that's a really old house in particular. But what I think was interesting when I was looking at a lot of these early houses, and you have these three, and there probably were more that are no longer extant. But what you start to see is, in this time period, these are 1730s houses, both on King's Highway. And when you start to see is, it seems like in the 1730s is when people start moving into this area. And in the, when I first started looking at some of this, I couldn't quite understand what was going on in the 1730s. And what we start to see, and we also see them out at the West End. This is a beautiful house out on Cedar Lake Road. This particular house is 1745, and the house on the right there is 1739. The house on the left is 1736. It seems as if that 1730s is kind of the era when people are moving in, and what we start to do is we start to see it in the records. In the 1730s is when they're coming up into Chester and they're surveying. In this particular case, this document from 1741, you can see there called Pattaconk land. So we start to see them using that term. This was always known as the North Quarter of Saybrook. The North Quarter, the furthest quarter. And quarter not meaning one of four, just quarter meaning the section in this particular case. But I think when Chester really gets established is in this document a year later. And in this particular document, you can see dated 1742, the 10th day of March, and it says, in the parish of Chester. And it talks about Cedar Swamp Pond. This is the first time we actually see that word Chester being used in this particular case. I've heard before that this, Chester comes from the ancestral home of the Waterhouses, although I've never been able to corroborate that, although there's some waitresses here in the audience, so I don't want to. But anyway, I can't corroborate that one way or the other if that is their ancestral home. But someone brought that from Chester, England, that name with them. As we go through, this is what I think is so fascinating, is what was bringing people to Chester other than the lure of land. Chester is a beautiful town, but it's hilly. And anybody that's ever dug in their yard will tell you, we produce great rocks, all rocks. So you kind of have to wonder to yourself, what was bringing people to Chester? And it really was these early industries, West Indies trade, which led to shipbuilding, which led to saw and grist mills, iron foundries, barrel making, stone quarries. This becomes kind of like, it starts to develop our town. And we can see some of this today. It's right with us. When I look at West Indies trade, You know, it's amazing. People don't realize, you know, if you look at the prior to the American Revolution, you know, the French and Indian War, when it was over, you know, we gave the British all of Canada, you know, in order to not take away some, because we wanted some of these islands in this particular place. You know, there was a time during the American Revolution that one of these sugar islands produced the amount of money that all of the 13 colonies produced. It was incredibly valuable. And the trade, now you have to say to yourself, yes, we want the sugar and the rum, but what do they want? And it was all the agricultural products we could produce. Not like we think of today, mass production, but it was the things like the pumpkins and the squash and the timber and the hogs and the oxen and the horses. And we were shipping everything you can imagine down to these West Indies. All in, you know, barrels or on the ship. I mean, you could be a farmer and you could just be growing, you know, whatever you had extra. You take it down to the wharf, get it onto the next ship. They would make note of that, and that was what was putting Chester on the map. It was what was putting Essex on the map, Old Saybrook and so forth. West Indies trade was absolutely incredibly lucrative for all of us. And we can see these ships, they were not big. This is a great ship. This is a more modern picture. This is right off of, I think it's right on the Deep River Chester line, but you can see a small little sloop here, and this was the type. And you can actually see a lot of these ships would actually have pens on the top for livestock or sheep or cattle. Below, they would, you know, load those barrels inside. Everything was brought on barrels. People don't realize that these barrels is how you didn't have crates. You couldn't put crates. You had to put barrels on the ship. Why did you put barrels on the ship? Because the docks and the wharfs and the ship were always moving. You couldn't lift them up. So the barrels could be just slid right up on there, as you're going to see. As we move into Chester, you can see this agriculture. This is a great shot. Any of you know where St. Joseph's Church is today? That is right there. You know, right in that side. That beautiful picture. It kind of gives you a sense of that idyllic quality that Chester had. And this is pictures probably I'm guessing 1880s and so forth, 1870s. But this is the type of stuff. When you look at the ship's manifest going down at the time, and the Connecticut River Museum has a lot of these. We have a number of these in our collection too, of Chester ships. And you can see the list of items going down, which were literally, you know, if you could bring, you know, 16 oxen, you know, I can't even read that, but horses being brought down. You'd see hay being brought down. I mean, the salt hay that would come from along the Connecticut River, they would send down in large quantities. Anything that you could produce that could go down. Clapboards, wood, lumber. I made a little list here of some of the stuff. Pork and beef and bacon and fowl and corn and flour and lard and cheese and hoops and staves. That's just a list of what was going out of Chester at any one particular time. What was coming back? Molasses, brown sugar, coffee, fruit, and so forth were coming back. I put this wonderful picture here. This is the corner of East Kings Highway and Route 154, Middlesex Turnpike. And this beautiful house was built in 1790, oh boy, I can't remember, 1790 something. And this is Jonathan Warner's house, probably the wealthiest merchant we ever had in town. And he built this beautiful house as a testament to his wealth. We know Jonathan Warner also because he's the man who started the Chester Ferry in 1764. And the Warners had that ferry for probably 130 years or so. And the Warners actually, you know, Jonathan Warner and his brothers were all involved in the West Indies trade, even to the point where, if we look at a particular list coming back in 1797, Jonathan Warner and his brother on the brig Matilda in 1797, it included the sale of 3 Negroes received by Phineas Warner, master, and sold by his order. But Jonathan was involved in this also. So they supplemented what was coming home any way they could in this particular case. Unfortunately, you know, we weren't unique in this. The whole Connecticut River Valley were slavers. Not big-time slavers like we think in the South, but they were slavers nonetheless. When I love this picture, again, the Connecticut River in the background, and you can see the Pataconk coming here. The reason I wanted to show you this is because this West Indies trade was so lucrative, so active in this particular area. It was the small town farmer who was selling his extra goods. It was the merchants who were, bringing the stuff back and forth. This is what was bringing people to Chester. This in the 1700s was what was putting Chester on the map. And as you can see in this 1795 map, it's a recreation that the Chester Historical Society has, but you can see this Pattacon Brook, what is today just a little brook, coming through, and here's Chester Center. And people don't realize, as a matter of fact, most Chester people don't realize that if you could go where, 4 Water Street is today, or in that marshy area, that was all a cove. A large cove that came into Chester. And the ships that came in weren't big ones, they were the small sloops and so forth, but they came in right into Chester Center. It's really hard for us to imagine that. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up and you talked to any people that were, I call them old timers, they would always refer to, oftentimes Chester Center was referred to as the cove for them. And when we look into this history, this is a great picture from Essex, but it shows you the small ships that were being built. We don't have any pictures for Chester. It's far, too distant in the past, whereas Deep River and Essex have great pictures, and I love this picture of Deep River. But it gives you a sense, this is Deep River right down at the landing, and it gives a good sense of the size of the ships and the launching of these ships. You can see one ship here just about completed, and you can see another one just getting started, the little plank going up there, all the lumber being brought through. This shipbuilding in Chester and these other towns really were economic engines for these towns. They really built the towns. The mills themselves, this is Nate Jacobson, wrote a great book on our mills, and you can see in Chester, in particular, you could see that we had 5 mills at one time, grist and sawmills. This particular one on the left is Nate's rendition of the Waterhouse Mill, which was up off of Goose Hill. We all have a nice tangible reminder of this at the Chester Historical Society, because these are the 2 grinding stones from that mill. That mill was that mill's from the 1730s, so these are most likely 1730s, 1740s era right there. I think it's really great when you can have something that literally touches back to the very beginning of time. We can see this mill here. This is actually on Deep Hollow Road. This is a oh boy, I gotta look now. This is a 1737 sawmill. And this today is a home. If you go on Deep Hollow Road, it's right there on the right on the brook. But it's amazing to think you have a 1730s mill right there. There was also a sawmill right on the Deep River Chester town line, which was on the Deep River. Believe it or not, the Deep River, actually there's a brook that goes through there called the Deep River. And there was one there. There was one out at Cedar Lake Road that was owned by John Douglas, which is goes out just about to when you hit Cockaponzit. And there was also one right at the bottom of Wig Hill. When Wig Hill intersects with 148, underneath that wooden bridge, we also have another mill there. So think about it. 5 sawmills actively. You're not building that many houses. What's all this lumber doing? It's not just shipbuilding. This lumber is going down to the West Indies. And it's not just the lumber that's going down for building in the West Indies, it's also things like cedar shingles that are going down to the West Indies. So this just shows you, so if you own property and you took trees down, it could mean money in your pocket. People also don't realize all winter long, the farmers would, when you didn't have anything work to do, you would take oak, and I think it was white oak you would use, and they would make these things called trunnels, tree nails. And they would carve them all winter, and you'd bring them to the shipyard, the building yard, and you'd sell them for, I don't know what they sold them for, but a farmer would supplement their income. All winter long, the family would be sitting by the fire, carving out those tree nails, because on ships they didn't use any iron on the outside. They used these tree nails to do the decking and planking on the side. Going the wrong way. Oh, there's that... I put the Chester Historical Society on here because a lot of people don't realize that Chester had iron foundries. at least 2 of them. In this particular one, the Chester Historical Society, our museum at the mill is an old iron foundry. It doesn't go back to the 1700s, but iron was an important part all the way well into the 1800s. And, you know, students used to always say to me, iron, they bring the iron all the way from Pennsylvania, or to the, you know, through Pennsylvania, out from Wisconsin. I say, no, we had bog iron. And bog iron was actually came from the bogs, you know, like we have in our area, these damp, marshy areas. They would find the veins of iron, they would dig them, you know, pound them out, and they would take them to be smelted in the iron foundries in Chester and in Essex, and then that would produce what was called pig iron, which is a brittle iron, but it works for things like anchors and chains and so forth. We can still see evidence of this today, not so much in Chester, but if you ever go out from Deep River toward, if you know the area at all, but you go out toward like John Winthrop Junior High School, and you take a right there, there's a series of ponds to the left and the right. Those are old colonial iron bogs. Except the one where you swim today, the town one is not. And what would happen was they would sit there and dig out an area, and they would follow a vein of iron, and they would bring it out, and they would, you know, send it off to be smelted down. But then when that filled up with water, they would follow the vein right next to it and dig down and start again. And that's why those 4 ponds are right in a row. As a matter of fact, when you go to old colonial maps of Deep River, Kelsey Hill Road, some of you local people know this, Kelsey Hill Road was known as Iron Cart Path. And West Elm Street was known as Iron Mines Road. And the Iron Cart Path went down to Essex, to the Falls River to be smelted, and Iron Cart Path came to Chester. And this iron was a big part of what we were doing in this particular area. Also, barrel making. You had to have a cooper. And all these towns had it. But today we can see this. You know, how would you do these? These barrels were always made of, you know, white oak was made for liquids, and red oak was made for more dry goods, and so forth. But when you made it, you had to have these poles that went around, kind of lock it in. In this particular case, these hoops. This is metal. But if you go back to the colonial days, they were done with a, let me see what they were done. They were done with a, can't think of the name of the particular, hickory or ash. And what was so interesting is when they would get the saplings so they could bend them around, those were called hoop poles. And the best hoop poles in our area came from what still remains, has the name today, Hoop Pole Hill Road. That's where the best came from. It just ended up there was a lot of hickory and ash up in that particular area. Another part that people don't realize are stone quarries. Stone quarrying was so important for building. And a lot of the foundations, if you look at old foundations in the 17 and 1800s, you'll always see these beautiful cut stones. Not until you go in the basement. Then you go in the basement, it's all field stone. They only use that nice cut stone on the top where you could see. But they also used them as building material for the structures themselves. What a lot of people don't know too is a lot of times when a ship was coming up here but didn't have a heavy cargo going back, they would often use cut stone for ballast in the bottom of the ship. And wherever their destination was, they would often, if they were taking back a load, they didn't need the ballast, they just dumped the ballast on the side somewhere. And that's why when you go to places like Boston or the lower part of New York, you'll often see these cobblestone streets. Those cobblestones are a lot of times made out of that, what they used to call ballast brick. But for us in Chester, I mean, we had several stone quarries, small ones. The most active one is behind the Catholic Church in Chester, way in the back there. And that particular one produced the most stone. There was also one down on Railroad Avenue, a little bit further down on the right, tucked in the back in the woods there. Any of you know St. John's in Deep River? A lot of that stone came from there. We also had another stone quarry on Bochum Road. There was another one north of Cedar Lake, Pelton Hill in Chester. There was one there. But the one that has always fascinated me the most is the one, if you, at the Chester Meeting House, and you look up on the hillside, you can see all the cut stone that came out of there. If you actually go up there sometimes and poke around, you can actually see the drill marks coming down. Any of you know the big, beautiful stone package store in Chester Center? It came from one of these quarries. In particular, not sure which one, but it came from one of these. So Chester really, I think what's so great about Chester is when you look at this early 1836 picture, this is about shipbuilding. It's about West Indies trade. So as you can see, when you look in a moment, this Colt house here, which is still there today, this Samuel Colt, not the firearms man, but Samuel Colt was a shipbuilder. We look at what's not in the picture here, the stone store, I'm guessing that's the stone store, that was William Buck, who was a shipbuilder. We look at this particular house here on Water Street, which was right next to the iron foundry, which is a little bit further there, and so forth. It's really all about shipbuilding, as you're going to see. When you look at this particular house, this is Samuel Colt's house today. They just redid this house. It's kind of when you're on that narrow part of Main Street, when you're coming by the flagpole, right on the right side. Samuel Colt built this. He was a shipbuilder and a merchant, and he had a wharf right here to the right of this. There. And as a matter of fact, when in the 1970s, when they were digging up behind what used to be the town office building, which was right on Main Street, the brick building there, they dug up chunks of the wharf. And we actually have a piece of that wharf in the Historical Society's collection. It was only saved because Bob Blair went out there and yanked it up, and the former first selectman and kept it. This picture I love because this building in the background, you see a little, the door at the top for loading stuff. This is Samuel Colt's storehouse, general store and storehouse. And this today is Maple and Main Art Gallery. If you've ever been in Maple and Main, you're going to see that there's beautiful columns coming up through the floor, kind of holding up the second floor. People don't realize those are colonial ship masts used. Yeah, no one realizes that today. But again, a piece of our shipbuilding history. When we look at the beautiful stone store here, this was William Buck, who was a shipbuilder, and this was his general store. Do you ever notice that general store? Do you ever notice, everybody today, it's the package store. But you ever notice with that? It doesn't face down Main Street. No, because it faces the cove. So when ships came up the cove, they would see William Buck's store right there, front and center. So again, we have such a strong shipbuilding past that we can still touch and feel today. It's a part of our history. But a lot of people always say, what changed that? Well, a couple things changed. Number one, Deep River right off of the landing has it's much deeper there. They could build bigger ships. It was closer to the sawmill for them. They floated the lumber right down the Deep River out into there. So they took a lot of business. Essex took a lot of business. The War of 1812 really cut into Chester's business. But I think, documented ships, documented ones, meaning ships, they started building in Chester in 1755, right at what was called the head of the cove, which would be right about where, Colt's wharf was. They started building the first ship there. But between then and the American Revolution, we don't have records. And a lot of people don't really wonder sometimes where are all the records. Well, the British took them with them when they left. So the old records of the shipbuilding, so we don't know how many ships were built prior to the Revolution. By the time we reach right after the War of 1812, shipbuilding really goes down pretty quickly in Chester, because bigger ships were being built in Deep River in Essex. But during that period that we do have records for, we can document at least 25 ships being built right here in Chester. And where were they being built? A couple spots. First of all, the main place that they were being built was right at where East Liberty and Water Street comes together, right there on the edge of the marsh. That was known as Dunk's Landing. It was also known as the old building yard. They didn't call them shipyards back then. They called them building yards. So a lot of times when you look in the old records, you often see just the reference to building yard. And that was owned by a number of shipbuilders. Started out with Leet and Buck, and then it later went on to Samuel Colt and Parmalee and Dennis and a number of them. But what ends up happening is eventually, right where Maravella's, this great little Italian place is today, we have this highway, this bridge right here. That bridge went in about 1819. It was a drawbridge. But when that bridge went in, it really cut off the flow of the water. And as a result, it silted in very quickly. What they did early on was, I couldn't find a recent picture, but if you know where Maravella's is, kind of kitty corner across the street is this wonderful old house that I just had an old picture of. And this is where the Denisons lived. And they had a little ship's chandlery in the downstairs here, a little ship's store. They lived upstairs, but right across the street, they built ships there for a number of years. And if you go today, it's all covered over. But when I was a kid, you could go out into the marsh there. There was large granite slabs that they would build the ships on before they launched them. But you can imagine that very quickly silted in. And it's really the wonderful marsh we know today. But when you look at all that grassy, that marsh grass there, you can imagine what this must have looked like in its day. This wide open cove coming through. It's really idyllic. It's a beautiful thing. I love this picture too, because if you look closely at this great picture, you can see a steam shovel here. And they're actually carving, the automobile had started to come in. So they're making Water Street bigger along there, along the edges there. Let me jump in for a moment to take a look at religion, because, these were Puritans, or later become known as Congregationalists in this area. And these early Congregationalists in our town were, Congregationalists in general were pretty strict. You didn't step out of line too much. Chester first, 1742, we get permission to build our own church. Now, why? Because it was too hard to go down to Centerbrook, which is where they had built a church, or Center Saybrook, in the winter and so forth. So they allowed this northern quarter, or what they called the Fourth Ecclesiastical Society, to build its own church. And this is a nice little artist rendition of that early church, and it was known as the Lord's Barn. That's what they called it, because it literally was a barn. I don't know, it was in the beginning if they even had any windows in there, and so forth. And they used to say that when services were going on Sunday, because the church had been built into a hill, that the sheep, when the weather wasn't good, the sheep would get underneath, or it was too hot, they'd get underneath into the cellar area. And they'd start bleeding, and they'd have to stop the service and knock them out of there. A lot of people, another thing, again, one of these tangible reminders to our past, is when you look at the entrance to the cemetery, where today, this church would have been right where that cemetery is. And you see those stone steps? Those are the steps into that first church. So it's a nice tangible reminder, a reminder of a time. And when you think about that, church being right here, and what's right across the street is that old burying ground. It would have been just perfect. Well, you can imagine by 1795, Chester, right after the American Revolution, Chester is really starting to, population's increasing, and they decide to build a new second meeting house, which we can see right here. These, tried to get a little collection of pictures today, the old meeting house here. And what's really neat about this is, first of all, you have to imagine it without this front on. And I didn't even realize until our town historian, Bob Maselli, was telling me that the original, you can see a road behind here, coming down. When I was a kid, the road went in front. There was a road in the back, and he was telling me that the church front was on the back side of the building, which I didn't realize that. He was explaining it all, the reasons for that. Anyway, they built this, and they were here until 1846. I mean, this church had a good run. And if you could imagine it without that front on it, it's a typical congregational meeting house. It very much looks like the Centerbrook meeting, congregational church. In this particular case, I'll talk a little bit later about this. But this, and what's really neat too is the material. They used a lot of the material from the Lord's barn when they built this. So I'm guessing if you go up into the rafters and so forth, you probably see a lot of old hand-sawed beams up there. I'm trying to get the guy that runs the town crew to let me go up there. He said he would, but he said I can't do it myself. But so by 1846, they built the third congregational church, which no longer exists. But if you want to know where this is, the Chester Public Library is right here. So this would kind of be right about in the edge of the parking lot for the Chester Public Library. It's a beautiful church. It really is when you look at it. And but you can imagine as time went on into the 1800s, this is 1846, as time went on, and we have an influx of Baptists coming in, because, Winthrop is like second oldest Baptist community in the state of Connecticut. Am I right on that, Kathy? Yeah. Anyway, second oldest, and the Baptists started to come in, and they had a church. That church was right at the end of Pleasant Street in West Main Street, but they very quickly outgrew that, and Russell Jennings, who I'll mention in a moment, with his factory, gave the money to build a Baptist church, which was right next to that. Well, these old Yankees never liked to tear anything down. They always reused it. And that first Baptist church, they actually moved just around the corner to Pleasant Street, and today that first Baptist church is this apartment.
Oh.
Right there. Yeah. As a matter of fact, all these little apartments inside of it. They used to call this the Beehive because of all the apartments. But when you actually look at the structure and you take off the porches, you can see a church right there. But what ended up happening was, and I love this picture, you can see here, library, Congregational Church, Baptist Church. And these two churches, I wouldn't say competed with one another, but they had large numbers, and you either belonged to one or the other. Those 1800s, God forbid you were Catholic, that's a whole other thing. But anyway, the Depression, the 1920s, the Depression, numbers dwindled in the churches. And by the time we reached the end of the Depression and into World War II, both churches were suffering tremendously for for numbers. So they combined. And they would have services, for 6 months in one church, 6 months in another church. Eventually that was not even economical. So what they decided to do was to take the two churches and combine them. Not just combine them with parishioners, but physically combine them. And you can see here, they did it. This is the Baptist church, and this is the Congregational Church. And that's why it is to this day the United Church of Chester. Coming together. Isn't that kind of cool? That's pretty neat. I don't remember, some of you in here might remember as kids when this was actually happening, but it's really kind of a neat story to think of that Yankee ingenuity of not wanting to tear down anything that was useful. Another great moment of that is the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church actually, they built the first Catholic Church in 1855. And it very quickly, the immigrant population, the Italians coming into town, very quickly the numbers swelled. So what they did is they took the 1855 church, and instead of tearing it down, they had a builder build a new church, but they gave him, I'm sure it was part of the deal, they let him have the old church. And this church here was completed in 1891. In 1928, they put an addition on, so it goes further back today. And they took the guy took the old church and he just picked it up and put it on rollers. They used to drag him with oxen, and he moved it. And that is the old church today, which is a style above hairdressing. Isn't that great? You can kind of see it right there, and so forth. Do you know what I love about this? This building here, St. Joseph's, which is the church I grew up in, is that when they put this addition on in 1928 to bring it further back, they redid the windows, and there was a competition. Because, this church covered Deep River, and it covered Chester, and there's a lot of Irish down there in Deep River, and a lot of Italians here. And if you ever look at the donations, who gave this the windows, you can see it's a competition between those Irish and the Italians. Let's talk. I'm not going very deep at all into industry, because when you come to the mill, a lot of you are going to be on the tour. We're going to have Skip Hubbard, who's done a great touch screen, and Kerry and Skip have done a lot of research into this. So they're going to give you the in-depth. I'm just going to tell you that if you went back into Chester's history, what you're going to see is that as shipbuilding declines, but there's wealth. Those shipbuilding merchants had money. And what they would do, and not just our towns, they did the same thing in Essex, is they would use that money and loan it out to entrepreneurs who wanted to start these mills. And what they did is they started going up the two branches of the Patagonk, and they started damming them up. This was not unique to Chester. This was going, you all remember Samuel Slater coming over from Great Britain and bringing the whole idea of the Industrial Revolution to America. Only takes a decade or two before it comes to Chester, and we start damming up we start damming up the Patagonk, and harnessed the power that came out of this. And it was really remarkable, the power that came out. So you could see, this is a picture from Russell Jennings, and you can see that undershot wheel right here, which would have been enclosed in the winter, so it didn't get iced up, but that water came flowing. You can see the pipe coming over here, and it would just spin that wheel, and it would move the belts and pulleys within the factory. And this is an old picture, which again, electricity's already in, but look at the tops. You can just see the belts and the pulleys with everything. Well, I got to tell you, as you're going to see, and Skip will tell you when you come to the mill, we had some big factories, but we had dozens. We had a lot of small factories. I can't tell you how many dams there are on the Patagonk. Skip, you want to take a guess on that? How many dams there were in the Patagonk?
There was 20 mill sites.
20 mill sites in Chester. Isn't that incredible when you think about it? But in the early pre-Civil War days, we see the early mills. They're the smaller mills that we think of, not the big mills that we're going to see after the Revolution. This is an after the Revolution mill. I mean, this is enormous, this mill. This is Russell Jennings. And you can see, can you see it? You can see the Baptist church in the background. So this is in the hollow down below. This is today a private home. I mean, this was amazing, as we'll talk about in a little while. This factory here, incredible. When we look at this particular one, this is M.S. Brooks on Liberty Street. The factory still exists. That factory is still there. Today they made hardware, small latches and hooks and so forth. Russell Jennings were augers and drill bits. And again, a lot more depth we can go to. This is the Silliman factory. They made inkwells. And later this was become the Bates factory, which made knitting needles, crochet hooks, manicures. I love this picture because you can see the waterfall right here. This waterfall was later taken down. This is the parking. This right now is the parking lot for the Goodspeed at Chester, the Norma Terrace. But they would just take down waterfalls. If they wanted to build it higher or move the waterfall, they would do that. Let me jump to something that's going on at the same time. I know I'm moving a little fast here, but again, one of the things that was happening at the same time was that I found fascinating in studying Chester history was this fighting for freedom. Chester had, all of New England, especially anybody that was going down to the West Indies was bringing slaves back. And we were involved. Not heavily involved, but we were bringing slaves back. And yet, a generation later, those very Warners who were bringing slaves back, they themselves were abolitionists. It's a neat thing with Chester is that we were very active on the Underground Railroad. When you look at this map that was done by Horatio Struthers in the 1960s, he drew, based on evidence of where slaves were hidden, he drew these maps. And you can see from Guilford, they came right up into Deep River, right up into Chester. And Chester was pretty active. The people that were here were active in the Abolitionist Society. And the hard part about it, as you know, with the Underground Railroad is people didn't document it. It's kind of like, hiding Jews in World War II. They didn't document it because it was secret. And that's what happened here. They weren't going to document it. But what we do know is that, for example, Noah Perry hid them right here on Baker Road in Chester. We know that Jonathan Warner, while he didn't hide them in this house, he was, now this is the grandson of our Jonathan Warner the merchant that's doing the West Indies trade. His grandson is orchestrating it. He's not hiding them that we know of in this house. And why? Because there was too much going on. He was too influential and so forth. But that whole East Kings Highway was really the epicenter for the Underground Railroad for us. So he was active in it. As a matter of fact, he was very outspoken. Even after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, where you could get arrested for harboring slaves, he didn't care. He didn't care. He made it very clear that he was out to help these slaves find their freedom. This is a house today on Kings Highway. When you go up Kings Highway, it's on the left. Any of you old people in Chester know this was Dr. Wheeler's house, and they hid them right there up in the attic area. This is another very old picture. I couldn't find a modern one, but this is also at the end of Kings Highway and Goose Hill. That's where Michael Price lives today, and they were hiding them there also, of the Underground Railroad. So it was really amazing the number of how active we were in this. And I still want to get up to the Connecticut Historical Society to look at the material they have for the abolitionist movement, because these Chester people must be there. One of the great things the Chester Historical Society owns is we have the election voter list from 1860. And it's in our collection. We had it up on display, but it's back in the vault. And I'm always amazed that no election list of Chester in its history, other than what is in the clerk's office, but nothing this far back. We don't have election lists, but this one was saved. And it's so obvious. I mean, I'm convinced that election of 1860 was saved, that voter list, because those abolitionists knew that that election day around Lincoln was monumental. That how important it was for them to have him, even though Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist, but he knew that slavery had to stop, and they did too. So I think we should be proud of our abolitionist past. This is a guy, going a little too fast here. This is Dr. Pratt, and Dr. Pratt, again, was trained as a physician, and he himself was a strong abolitionist. Didn't hide any slaves, but he was also very involved. He later, during the war, would go into military service. We have his entire collection of letters, his medical, the saw there. You wonder what that's sawed off. We have great stuff. It's his medical equipment. But when you look at his letters, he talks about being in, around Washington area, and he's sending blacks back. And he's making reference, when they're coming through, to get them on their way. So, and again, I think it's pretty amazing this man was willing to put his neck out on the line to help them. He had a beautiful house that he didn't build himself. It was built by Abraham Mitchell, who was a merchant. Built this beautiful house, which used to be on Route 154, right across the street from the Catholic Church. It was moved in the 1960s, and there it is today. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. So keep in mind, again, that abolitionist movement, which will continue. We're going to be doing some work with the Historical Society about how that movement to help African Americans continues in our history. The post-Civil War years is really when our town takes off. If we were to look before the Civil War, we have these. It's like an adult. It's like a young kid growing up. It's getting its legs. It's after the Civil War that this town really takes off. And when that happens, it's still an idyllic town. This is a great picture of Chester Cove. We can see, this is Dr. Pratt's house here. You can see that early Catholic church there on the right. It's the only picture we know of right there. You see a little boy sitting there. This picture here is probably, 1880s. But I think Chester in the post-Civil War years was just idyllic. I mean, it just had to have been just such a wonderful place. You can see Chester Center right there. I love this picture too, because you can see an automobile. And of course, but Chester starts to take more of shape as we know today. Any of you know, you can see this today is the Paddock Inn. Right there, you can see Samuel Colt's house here. You can see William Buck's store here. They're no longer into West Indies trade in the post-Civil War years. Now it's becoming more everyday, like we would think of dry goods and grocery stores and meat markets and so on. But by the time we reach around 1905, Chester's population is booming, and we build a union school in 1905. We had 4 one-room schoolhouses. They're all combined into. Any of you, next time you drive toward Chester and you go past Camp Hazen, the office right there on the left is an old one-room schoolhouse. And we had 4 of them. But they built this beautiful union schoolhouse right there. Today, that is the Chester Firehouse. Well, not the building, but on that spot is the Chester Firehouse. And you could see we had a very diverse, changing population. Not only did we have, farmers, and we had mill workers now, children of mill workers. We also had a lot of immigrants, Italian immigrants in particular, coming into Chester. It's kind of horrible when you read some of the, when you listen to old timers, and they would tell you oftentimes in school they made the Italians sit in the back. Yeah, they weren't kind to them. But I wanted to bring up something interesting. The Chester Meeting House in 1846, when it stops being used, it kind of sat abandoned. And for 30 years, it was abandoned. And finally, in 1876, they were going to tear it down. And when they were going to tear it down, a group, two men in particular, Stephen Shortland and Merritt Brooks, got together and they decided to refurbish that and turn it into a hall for the town, a building for town. If you've been inside the meeting house, you know it really is the center of a town. They put a front on here with a ticket booth. There was a little stage off the back. Now I have to tell you, the only pictures we have of the inside of the meeting house are some old graduation photos. I'll show you in a minute. But what was really amazing was, this one. I was in Maine 20 years ago, and I'm in a little shop. My kids are sleeping in the car. My wife's sitting with them. I'm poking around a little antique shop. And the guy said to me, what are you looking for? I said, anything Chester. Chester, Connecticut. And the guy looks at me and goes, I have an opera house from Chester. Wow. I have an opera house. I said, no, an opera house. You must be mistaken. And he goes, no, it's a stereo-optic card. So, of course, he shows me the card. I didn't want to get excited. So I paid him his $5. And I got a stereo-optic card from probably the earliest photo right here. That's one picture of the interior of the meeting house, probably right after it was finished. The reason I show you this is because that meeting house, after 1876, it becomes the heart of Chester. It really does. You can see a graduation photo here. I think this is 1909. You can see another, that's 1909. It's probably the same group. Yeah, it's the same picture. They're just sitting down. The piano, but here you can see right here, this is the exact same stage as we know today. Chester as Chester's population increased, it started to, community became so important to this town. And why? Because you had these people who weren't farming all day. They're working in the mills. And they needed, they wanted this sense of identity. And we start to see that. We just put up this exhibit at the Historical Society, so when you come, you'll get to see it. It's about creating community, and we see all these different organizations in time. Everything from the Cedar Lake Club, up at the top, to different plays that they put on. We see the Chester Club here, the Garden Club, the Boys Model Club. I mean, it really talks about the way Chester came together. Really, I would say, is the town we think of today. We started to see a band. This is the Cornet Band right in front of the Chester House. If any of you know where Leif Nielsen's studio is today, that's the hotel that was there at one particular time. That sign actually right there, they found about 20 years ago, and we just restored it and we hung it at the mill. That sign is from the 1840s. It's kind of neat. I'd like to take credit for that, but Art Christensen gets all the credit. We can see, again, fife and drum. Do you know Chester has one of the oldest fife and drum corps in the country? 1868, I think it is. Really old. And we can see them here down in Chester Center. It's a great picture. We see them later on in the 1930s, I believe that was. Chester fife and drum's always been a big part of Chester. This is something most people don't know. We had a horse racing track in Chester. Most Chester people don't know we had a horse racing track. And it was called the Chester Driving Park. It was a half-mile racetrack, and the Chester Driving Park Association. Carrie's done a lot of research in the New Era. We keep finding these different advertisements or different news pieces about it, who was winning and so forth. But here's what's really cool. This is a 1940s, I believe, it is 40s, image of an aerial view when they first started taking them. This is Route 154. This is Kings Highway and East Kings Highway. And if you can follow my pointer, let's see, my pointer won't show up. But anyway, you can see the outline of the racetrack right here. See it right there? That's right where the Jewish synagogue, the Jewish temple is today. Yeah, the Chester Driving Park. It's really kind of neat to think. And this was active for probably 25, 30 years. I think World War I, it kind of stopped. But they came from all over Middlesex County to see these races. I had to put this in here just in case Pete Zanardi was here, but it is important, is the Italians. And I got to tell you, in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, the Italians really came into Chester and filled a void. What they did was a lot of wood. This is a Ferrari family. I'm guessing that's Sherry Ferrari's family right there. This picture I love. The Italians had these enormous picnics in the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of, a couple of Italian families here in the thing probably heard stories about these, but they were very active in wood cutting, charcoal, stone masonry. Stone masonry was probably a really big one, and you can see they even had their own Italian-American society, which was really quite amazing, because if you read the beginning of this, of the Italian-American Mutual Aid Society, which was founded in 1910, their goal was to promote and encourage the union, welfare, and friendship of all its members. I think they just took care of each other. I think as many of the old-timers at the time were looking their nose down at these Italians, they were going to show them. I love this picture. They built that stone store. You know where 4 Water Street is? You can see them building that right there. Beautiful building, which I kind of caught a little picture on the right there. That's another picture I always love, because when I was a kid, this was a gas station.
Yeah.
And none of you remember Dengler's Garage. And if you ever look at the windows on the front, they're kind of garage bays. You know, that big grass part was low down and stuff like that. I used to think it was really cool to go in there as a kid. Anyway, just so you can see, I think what ends up happening... Oh, I wanted to mention, before we leave those Italians, today, the names, Agnelli, Bononomi, Bergunzi, Calamari, Carini, Castelli, Cuneo, Ferrari, Grote, I was doing this off the top of my head, Lanzi, Lavazzoli, Linguadoca, Monti, Perotti, Radici, Scalia, Tizzi, Zanardi, Zanelli. These are all names we grew up with. These Italians really played a big part in our that history of the town, and very important history. So make sure you tell Pete Zanardi if you see him. A nice little plug. Chester really starts to become the town we know today. You can see the Chester Bank right here. You know, the early bank. You can see Feinstein's store right here, clothing store, which was around when I was a little kid. My mother talks about going in there. Look at that, groceries, hardware, dry goods, and so forth. You can see it just a different angle there. It really was, you didn't have, even when I was a little kid, you didn't have to leave this town. It had a grocery store, it had a pharmacy, it had a hardware store, it had a clothing store, Feinstein's, 2 or 3 liquor stores. It had everything you would actually need. You can see that great picture of Feinstein's store right there. Yeah, it's really great. And by 1916, even the trolley was coming in. Right here. Didn't last long. Unfortunately, had a number of accidents, a few years. Chester was the last to the end of the line. They encountered a number of accidents, and it caused them to go bankrupt. Any of you who have ever been in Chester Center, you know Simon's Market's right over here, the River Tavern, and right across the street, people always park in front of that stone kind of wall. Well, if you ever see it with cars not there, which you very rarely do, written in little white stones, is Chester. And the trolley company built that there, so you knew that was your stop in Chester. It was idyllic. But you know, it all started to change. Chester really, I shouldn't say changed. Things were still booming, but Chester started to change a little in the 20th century. I stuck this picture in there because we see young Johnny Alexander on the right, who was killed in the war. The VFW is named after him. But there's St. Joseph's. You can see that 154 started to become busy. This was the highway. This was Route 9. You know, my mother will tell you, like, you couldn't even pull out onto this road in the summer. It was so busy. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a personal story. I was born the day before Christmas, and my mother went into labor, and my grandmother was driving, and my father was in the back seat, and they couldn't get up 154 because Route 9 didn't exist. My father proudly delivered me in the back seat. Oh yeah, don't. My mother doesn't like to remember that. When Dr. Tate met her at the hospital, but my father did a good job. Anyway, they built an addition to the high school. You can see that old Union School there, but they built this big brick addition. Chester was growing, and it was growing really fast in those post-year time. And you can see Chester now looks like we think of today. All of these stores were filled. Meat markets, fruit and vegetable markets, grocery stores, and so forth. When you look at this picture, you know, you can see, the Checker store, and I think this is the A&P right here, and Robbie's. I mean, everybody. Robbie's was like a mainstay, the soda fountain and card shop when I was a kid. A little further down, we would have seen, you know, a pharmacy right in here. It was a fast-growing town, but it was a great town. It really was. My mother and some of you in here will tell you it was a great town to grow up in. And there you can see, that is Simon's Market here, the Atlantic and Pacific grocery store, right next to a First National store. I mean, 2 grocery stores in this town is how fast this town was moving. Why? Because these factories were booming. Booming. Russell Jennings, I mentioned a little earlier ago. Do you know, by the time we reached the 1930s, 1940s, where these pictures are taken, Russell Jennings was the largest drill bit manufacturer in the world.
Wow.
Oh yeah, and then finally, 1964, Stanley Works in New Britain bought them out. You know, it's really amazing. C.J. Bates, knitting and crochet needles, manicure sets, all over the United States. Many of you know Susan Bates from your knitting and so forth. And they eventually were bought by Coates and Clark in South Carolina, I think it was, and moved the production there because, again, they were competition. M.S. Brooks and Sons with their hardware, small hardware. You don't have to think of the latches and the hooks you'd have. That's what they made. And those were just 3 of them. Dozens of factories, and Chester was really moving along with these dozens and more. I would probably say if you could think about a time prior to World War II, I often think of, you know, the bells, the whistles, the hammers. My mother used to say that you could walk in Chester Center in the summer when the Jennings factory windows were open, and the hammering was just unbearable coming through. But you know, times were changing, and the post-war years were not good to any of these towns, as mills closed and went elsewhere or were sold out and so forth. And we see, you know, M.S. Brooks here, which held on, I think, until the late 80s, early 90s. We can see the old Jennings factory here in the late 1940s, still doing a booming business, but these were big behemoth mills. They really were. These few were big mills, and they were dying. You know, and you can see here the old C.J. Bates factory, which was, again, that sewing factory. You can kind of get the sense of the Goodspeed of Chester right here. I can remember as a kid, I used to go and watch my grandma. She used to sort all those needles. I thought it was fascinating. But again, they had built a big, beautiful factory up on Route 154, but within a few decades, that was moved on. And we start to see the town start to get a little scruffy around the edges, Robbie's and so forth. I had a conversation with my mother on the way here, talking to her about Chester, and they said, well, you know, Chester was kind of dying. Oh, she got very indignant with me on the phone. Don't you tell me Chester was transforming itself. Anyway, and you can see, here's the Chester Pharmacy. Again, active pharmacy. You know, you never had to leave Chester. When I was a kid, I loved the Village Hardware. I loved going into Creanie's Hardware to buy my fishing tackle there. It was fun. It was really a neat place. I think one of the best things about Chester when I was a kid was every Friday night the bank would stay open till what, 7 o'clock was it? Wow. And everybody would go down to Chester Center. And you know, and I loved it. You'd see all your friends. A lot of times Little League would be getting out, and they'd all come down. And it was a simpler time. My family always did the same thing. My parents did the banking, yelled at us for making too much noise. And then we would always stop into Robbie's, buy our little thing of Borden's ice cream, little bottle of Hires root beer, and go home and make floats. It was magical. It really was a great time. But in time, Chester needed to transform itself. It needed to find a little bit of an identity. If you could have been in Chester in the late 80s, it kind of looked a little rough around the edges. And I think a lot of that changed. There you can see Shirley's Ceramics, which is today Otto's Pizza. That building doesn't exist anymore.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, isn't it? But Chester did find a new identity. And I think that's what's really wonderful. I think, you know, when I look at that identity that Chester started to change, I think it was really the innovation of a few people. You know, I think when you go way back at Stuart Joslin, or some of you remember, started to renovate. No question about Judy and David Joslin. I mean, they were like, when they redid the Maple and Maine. I think that really got the ball rolling as they started to move. And Chester's become a community that, look at the farmers market, attracts a tremendous amount of people coming into it. There's Maple and Maine, those great posts coming up. I have to tell you, if you could have been in the 1970s and someone said, this is going to be an art gallery someday, I would have been like, no, it's not. You can see the Norma Terrace. Goodspeed came in and bought the old factory, and it's wonderful, the transformation. We have that Chester Road Race. I can tell you, I ran it the first year, and I came in almost at the end. And so, I mean, it just really is a great, great town today. Not many towns have been able to transform themselves. I think when you come on, many of you people who come on the driving tour, residents of Masonicare here, or you come to our mill, all of you come to our mill, you can take a deeper dive. I think the beauty of Chester is it's a town that's always been able to reinvent itself, or invent itself. You know, throughout its entire history, we have so much to be proud of along the way, and you can see there, it's just really wonderful. And at the, it's really great where we've come. It's something. I walk through Chester Center, I don't know anybody anymore. It's great. Isn't it beautiful? And you know, that still is the heart of the town. It really is. We're very proud of it. All right. 1 hour. Wow.